This is a second take on this video because I tried to upload it yesterday, and maybe because of the thunderstorm, his power was going in and out. When I went to upload it, I could not find it, so it mustn't have saved. So we're beginning again with March of 2014. We've already talked about the developments in Maidan Square and the occupation of the Crimea by the little green men that turned out to be Russian soldiers with their insignias and identifying markers taken off. Um, we talked about the Russian reaction. They felt that Crimea should have always been a part, well, since Catherine the Great and her lover Potemkin had conquered it, that the Crimea should be a part of Russia. On March 16th, the Crimea held a referendum to see if the people wanted to rejoin Russia. And of course, it was an overwhelming victory for Russians. That prompted a series of sanctions from the United States. And then on March 18th, Putin formally accepted the transfer of the Crimea from Ukraine to the Russian Federation. Now, shortly after that, in April, we have the beginning of this uprising in the eastern Ukraine, in the area called the Donbass, Donbass. It's a heavy industrial area and mining area. It was very important for the industrial development of the Soviet Union, and many Russians, particularly Russian-speaking people, lived there. Now, if you remember, during the Soviet Union, it was one country. People were transferring all over the place. It was not unusual for people to be born in Moscow and yet raised in Kazakhstan, or born in Tajikistan and raised in Ukraine, because they went where they were assigned, where there was jobs. So there are Russian-speaking people throughout Ukraine, but they are heavily concentrated in eastern Ukraine because that has a continuous border with the Russian Federation, or the Russian Republic of the old Soviet Union. So there's a lot of people in eastern Ukraine that see themselves as Russians and would prefer to be a part of the Russian Federation. So there was this uprising. Now we know that Putin and the people around Putin, personally, people around him, encouraged this uprising as a way to put pressure on the Ukrainian government in Kiev, because by now they've got Yanukovych is out, and the government that is being installed, this temporary government, is very pro-Western. So you have this uprising. Now also, there's if you look at any of the writing from the Russian perspective, they're always claiming that the new Ukrainian government is heavily influenced by fascists. And now this is because you have to go back again and remember that when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, as they marched into Ukraine, many of the people in Western Ukraine treated them as liberators, that they were freeing them from the Bolsheviks. However, as the German control got established, the Germans treated all Ukrainian people as they treated the Russian people. They were Eastern Slavic people. They felt they were worthless. They were treated as slaves, and so that provoked a rebellion. But there was still a lot of feeling after the Second World War that, particularly in the western part of Ukraine, that they should be independent. They ought to be separate from the Soviet Union, and since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been the rise of a number of these neo-fascist gangs that provided military support to this fledgling Ukrainian independent government. And Russia has a legitimate complaint, I think, that the Ukrainian government has never really cracked down on these fascist groups because they're so desperate for support, they were taking it from anyone. But you can see in the statements that come out about the uprising in the Donbass that often this is pictured as um, heroic, patriotic Russians fighting against fascism, fighting against the fascism they see dominating the government in Ukraine. Well, in April, you have these mass gunmen going into government buildings, particularly in the towns of Donetsk and Luhansk, and in the region surrounding these two towns. And that formed the basis for this separatist movement in the eastern Ukraine that was supported uh, materially and financially by the Russian Federation. Okay? As a way to put pressure on the Ukrainian government. The argument was that they ought to give this region more autonomy because Ukraine was a federal system. They wanted to give it more local autonomy uh, and perhaps even a separate entity. Uh, and there are those that wanted to join with the Russian Federation. While this is going on, we have the announcement in the press of the finalization of the Putin divorce. And on April 4th, as part of this pressure on Ukraine, Gazprom, and this is at the bottom of the sheet that you have, Gazprom announces an end to the discount prices for Ukraine. Now, again, we have to remember the situation: the Soviet Union, Ukraine, all one country. The Soviet Union. You remember that prices were supported by the regime, kept very low. So the price of oil and gas in the Soviet Union was far below the market value on the world market. And, and so these countries that were part of the Soviet Union still expected to be paying these lower subsidized prices for gas and oil that come from the Russian Federation. Well, this gives the Russian Federation a lot of leverage, and so Gazprom, this big natural gas monopoly in Russia, that is so closely linked with the regime, because it's one of these national resource champions that Putin has talked about, that it, under instructions from the regime, puts pressure on Ukraine by uh, raising the gas price to closer to higher to world level, and that puts the Ukrainian government in a pretty serious financial situation. Also, at the end of April, you have a second round of sanctions being put on Russia because of the intervention in Crimea and now the support for the separatist movement in the Donbass. May 9th, you have Putin celebrating Victory Day. That's the day that World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, ended against Germany. And he celebrates that in Crimea to show this linkage of Crimea to the Russian Federation. On May 25th, 2014, you have national elections in Ukraine for a new president. Remember, Yanukovych has fled the country. The interim government has been set up. They hold national elections, and Petro Poroshenko is elected. And I'll spell his last name. Very simple: Poroshenko. Poroshenko. Petros, first name Petro. Okay. He gets 54.7% of the vote in the first round. There's no need for a runoff. He gets he's famous in the country because he's an oligarch. He's made a lot of money. He's called the Candy King. He owned the biggest candy company, biggest candy factories in Ukraine. The voting in the eastern part of the Ukraine was kind of sporadic. In some cities, there was voting in Kharkov, for example, but in the areas, particularly Donetsk and Luhansk, that are clearly under the control of these separatists, there was hardly any voting there. So it's not a complete vote, But a new government's been established, and the West recognizes this as the legitimate government of Ukraine. In June, President Obama condemns the Russian aggression. It's a pretty strong word, yes, Russian aggression in Ukraine. This Western effort is consolidating itself when the G7 meet in Brussels. And then, unfortunately, uh, in July, there is this terrible, horrendous incident of MH17, which stands for Malaysian Air Flight 17. This is I think it was a big Boeing jet with 283 passengers and 15 crew members on board. The flight was from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and it was shot down as it flew over the eastern part of Ukraine, the part that is under contention between the separatists and the Ukrainian government. Since the flight originated in Amsterdam, most of the people on board were Dutch, and so it was the Dutch Safety Board that conducted the investigation of the flight. This was difficult for them because, as I said, the flight came down in contested area. Uh, the Russians and the separatists were unwilling to let the safety board in. Eventually, negotiations did permit this, but it was several days after the event. And the Russians started, as soon as the plane was shot down, claiming that this was shot down by a Ukrainian aircraft or a Ukrainian air-to-ground missile. Well, there's been a number of intelligence services and non-governmental organizations tracking developments, Russian military involvement in eastern Ukraine. In fact, one of them is a think tank in Washington where one of my former students works. And the last time she came back to campus, she brought a lot of evidence that she shared with me and with my class about the Russian involvement. And we know certainly that this plane was shot down by a Russian ground-to-air missile. We even know the unit that it came from. It was the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade of the Russian Federation. But the Russians have denied this, but this has been pretty clear that it was Russian involvement. As soon as it happened, the Russians realized this was a mistake, and they withdrew this particular unit from eastern Ukraine. Of course, this horrendous disaster led to a new round of sanctions where the European governments piled on it with the Americans. Sanctions directed at Russia to make Russia pay an economic price for its intervention in Ukraine and for the loss of all of these lives in the aircraft. As a result, Russia's looking around for ways to strike back at the West, and what they did in September was end a long-standing high school exchange program where students who have been studying English come over to the United States, and students from the United States go over and spend a semester a year in Russia. November 11th, in a speech, Putin says that the United States wants to subdue Russia. He really believes that behind the developments in Maidan is a plot by the United States to put the Soviets in the Russians in a subservient position. And he's talked about this in 07 at the Munich conference, where he talked about the United States desiring to control the world. He really believes that the Americans and all of these Western non-governmental organizations that rushed in at the collapse of the Soviet Union to try to help establish a civil society, all of them were plotting against Russia, and Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, was behind a lot of this. The source of this animosity. So Putin and the people around him believe that the United States really created this color revolution, and that and that's in 2003, and they now believe that they wanted to finish the job to drive out Yanukovych and drive Ukraine away from Russia. They were behind the Maidan protest. Um, so you can see this gap between the United States and Russia is getting wider and wider. Now, November 23rd, there's an interesting line I have there. Um, it's a throwaway line that a reporter asked him some question, and Putin said something like, "I won't be president for life." Now, what did he mean by that? What was the plan? Because you remember I've said all Russian politics revolves around the future elections of the president. Who's going to run? Who's going to be in charge in the Kremlin? All right. Now, on the 28th of November, there was a very strange series of demonstrations. Strange because the people who came out in the street to protest were this was not their thing. These were not typical Russian protesters. These were professional doctors, nurses, hospital workers who came out complaining about hospital closing, the terrible condition that they were working under, and all this goes back to how the economy in the last few years with Putin has begun to stagnate, and prices have been going up, wages have remained flat, and the government, under economic pressure from the West and falling oil prices, has been looking for ways to shore up its financial strength to keep the sovereign fund and the rainy day funds strong. And so they've been slowly cutting back on all human services, cutting back on state support for hospitals, education, transportation. Remember, we talked about the efforts to restructure the pension plans in the past. They were also particularly concerned because, as a result of the sanctions that were being imposed on, starting particularly with people that were around Putin, there was an effort in the Duma to pass a law that would reimburse these companies controlled by oligarchs that were suffering as a result of the sanctions. And one of the uh, companies, or one of the people that was hurting as a result of these sanctions, was Putin's old judo partner and close friend, who, because of his relationship with Putin, has become a multimillionaire, a man named Arkady Rohan and Rothenberg, Arkady Rothenberg, Rothenberg. So someone came up and called this possible law the Rothenberg Law. That was never passed. There was too much opposition in the Duma, and what do you call it? The appearance looked too bad that Putin was just passing this to help his friends. But this brought these doctors and nurses out protesting that the safety net that the Soviet Union used to provide and that the Russian government was pledged to is not being lived up to, and they were really upset. And this was a black eye for the Putin administration. And then in December, the ruble hits a new record low to show how the economy is not growing, and how troubling the economy is in Russia. But as you've read the Sakwa book, Putin's concern is with the security of the system, the strength of the state, and the welfare of the average Russian citizen is a lesser concern, even though he speaks about improving it all the time. But the reality is that if the oil prices aren't high, he's going to put his money behind strengthening the power ministries, the force services, as Hale talked about in the article, and everything else is going to be secondary. Now, I want to talk a bit about the address he makes to the Russian Federation, President Putin, in December. Is kind of an end of the year address, and a lot of it is devoted to the discussion of foreign policy. Uh, where he says that the action that the government took in relation to the Crimea and Ukraine were necessary for Russia's survival. He stresses that Russia, as a sovereign country, needs to act when it feels threatened, and certainly it felt threatened by these developments, meaning an independent Ukraine that was leaning towards joining the EU and NATO. He warns Russians that lean economic times are ahead. Well, that's certainly the case that they're living under today. He says the sanctions that are being imposed upon Russia from the West after the annexation of Crimea calls them pure cynicism, saying that these would have been imposed on Russia without any reason. That's an interesting statement. But again, this is what the Russian people hear from their leader. And he says again that Russia will not go the way of Yugoslavia. Now, to think back, this is an international issue, but this is in Putin's mind, and it is going to be the forefront in his mind. He can look back to the collapse of the Yugoslavian Federation, when the Soviet Union was withdrawing from Eastern Europe and countries were establishing their own independence. Um, you may remember in the 90s, from your readings anyway, the efforts at separating Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and all these areas, pushing to get out of the Federation of Yugoslavia that the communists, especially under Tito, had held together this very diverse region. And then, so Putin in his mind traces the collapse of the central government Yugoslavia to intervention by the West, encouraging dissidents, encouraging groups to develop in Serbia, particularly demanding free and fair elections, demanding an end to the dictatorship of Milosevic, the existing president there. And so from complaints against Yugoslavia to the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, to the Rose Revolution in Georgia, to the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, all of these efforts at overthrowing existing power. And then put that into context with the Arab Spring, which again Putin feels that it's a Western plot to overthrow the governments and to establish Western control of the Middle East, particularly in terms of the former sort of ally of Russia, Gaddafi in Libya. This is why Putin is so committed to the support of the Assad regime in Syria, because he wants to stand up against what he sees this Western aggression against established leaders, part of, as he said back in Munich, this U.S. desire to establish a unipolar world with the United States as the number one power. All right, I'm going to end this video here. I didn't get as far as I did the other day, but if you remember, I've said I want to keep these videos under 30 minutes so they're easier to upload, and I'll do another one starting on January of 2015. All right, let's hope I can get this one uploaded today and not have any other problems.